Hi everyone, welcome to the South Central Climate webinar that we're going to be doing today with Sean Wineland as he talks a little bit about some work that he did through the Science to Action Fellowship through our National Center. And so I'm just going to hand it over to Sean now.
Cool. Thanks, Emma. So this is sort of the final presentation that I'm giving for the Science to Action Fellowship project that I've been working on. So my advisor is Dr. Tom Neeson here at OU, and I'd also like to recognize Abigail Lynch. She's my mentor for the Science to Action Fellowship. And so I'm going to be talking a lot about environmental flows in this presentation. So I just wanted to sort of introduce that concept to folks if they're not familiar with it. So environmental flows are used to talk about mitigating the adverse impacts from water diversion and storage. So we can look at a hydrograph of a river at a certain point and see the natural hydrograph in blue and the other sort of minimum flows or functional floodplain flows that people talk about. And we use that to mimic a concept known as the natural flow regime, which is kind of defined as the quantity, timing, and quality of river flows. And these, mimicking the sort of natural flow regime that riverine and floodplain ecosystems need is essential for that ecosystem structure and function. And so we can think about all of these things that are impacted by environmental flows, right? So floodplains, water quality, groundwater, vegetation, and habitat for fish, amphibians, and macroinvertebrates. And where we're thinking about studying environmental flows is in the Red River Basin. So this river basin extends from the western extent all the way into New Mexico and the eastern extent all the way down into Louisiana. So there's a pretty wide precipitation gradient that we can see throughout the Red River Basin. And also throughout the Red River Basin, there's a lot of reservoirs, mainly used for municipal and agricultural uses. In this study, we're looking at 38 major reservoirs throughout the river basin. And some of the challenges to implementing environmental flows or just thinking about general water issues throughout the basin. First one, obviously climate change is a huge factor here. So this is some work that recently came out from Renee McPherson here at the South Central Climate Center and a colleague. Main takeaway here is that there's some uncertainty with future climate projections. So each one of these panels is a climate scenario and a different downscaling method that was used for this study. But I think the main takeaway here is that if you look at some of the western portions of the basin, they're going to decrease in precipitation, and under certain scenarios, maybe some of the eastern parts of the basin will get wetter. But overall, there's some decreasing precipitation and uncertainty with climate change in the Red River Basin. Another challenge is that if we look at current water availability, there's currently not enough water to meet societal and environmental water needs. So this is some work that came out from a postdoc in my lab last year, Ahmed, and this study sort of looked at how satisfied we can make the water for municipal and agricultural needs, and how much can we satisfy environmental flows. And so we can look at the trade-off between those two factors. And so the blue line here is showing current water allocation. You can see that we can't fully satisfy either societal and environmental flows. But if we reduce or conserve water up to 21%, we can fully achieve those goals. And we can see some spatial variation here throughout the river basin in terms of where those factors are sort of distributed. So in the western portions of the basin, we can see it's harder to achieve those environmental and societal flow needs. Another challenge to implementing environmental flows and just general water management in the basin is some complex water governance issues. So in 2013, there was a Supreme Court case. It was basically Texas versus Oklahoma. Texas wanted to take some water from some rivers that were fully in Oklahoma, basically saying that the water in the main stem of the Red River is too salty. And they cited the Red River Compact, which basically sets out like some equal share of the water between all the states in the basin. But the decision from the Supreme Court sided with Oklahoma, stating basically state sovereignty to the water within its political boundaries. Another more recent sort of complex issue was settled in 2016 between Oklahoma and some of the tribes within the state. So Oklahoma City wanted to tap some water from Sardis Lake, given the growing urban demand. The tribes disputed, basically citing an old treaty from the 1800s, and the settlement was actually a success. So the states are going to retain the authority over the water, but must adhere to the tribe's conservation standards and needs. Another challenge is that there's no environmental flow regulations. So in Texas, Texas has an in-stream flows program, and we can see all the river basins that have adopted environmental flow standards here. The Red River has not adopted an environmental flow standard. So Texas evaluates if new permits will impact like a standard flow that they set within each river basin. However, that program has not been adopted in the Red River Basin. In Oklahoma, there's currently no environmental flows policies besides some very coarse guidelines in the Red River Compact. So they basically say, like, near the border where the Red River reaches Arkansas, there must be like 2,000 cubic feet per second or something. But other than that, there's no environmental flows policies in the state. However, the Oklahoma Water Resources Board has developed an in-stream flows advisory group they've sort of set out some timelines here and actions that they've completed. They've completed a pilot study in the Illinois River Basin to look at the feasibility of implementing some sort of environmental flows. And there's currently a bill in the State Senate of Oklahoma that would establish environmental flows in what they call treasured streams, which are sort of like scenic rivers. But that bill has sort of been in limbo since March of last year. So Oklahoma is thinking about environmental flows, but sort of slow to get there. And so based on all these challenges, these socio-political environmental challenges in the Red River Basin, I had the following questions for this project. So what are water decision makers' views on environmental flows and water-related issues? What are the major data needs and barriers to implementing environmental flows regulations? And what types of environmental flow regulations do decision makers think are feasible to implement? And do they need any help making those decisions? Maybe we could provide them with a decision support tool. And so the first aspect of this project, we did a survey, or thought a survey could initiate some sort of deeper discussion around environmental flows. And so the target audience for this survey was agencies who make decisions about water allocation or water management, agencies who make decisions about freshwater species management, and any organizations that might aid or influence those decisions about either of those things. The geographic scope of the survey was any organizations or agencies in Texas and Oklahoma. And the goals of the survey sort of reflect those questions that I had on the previous slide. So I wanted to better understand decision makers' views on environmental flows, better understand data needs and barriers, what method of environmental flows is feasible to implement, and any decision support needs. So we sent out the survey. We got around 38 responses, but we only had about 24 usable responses due to respondents in completing the survey. So we clustered those complete responses using a k-means clustering to sort of group those respondents based on similar values or beliefs regarding environmental flows. And yeah, if there's any like social science people out there, they're probably screaming right now, like, that's such a small sample size. And yeah, it is, but I think, so our thinking here is that since we're surveying these agencies and organizations, these responses sort of reflect those agencies' views as a whole, and maybe sample size isn't so much important here, rather than just getting a really core scale view of what they think about environmental flows. And so, yeah, so we clustered those responses. The first cluster here, we had 9 people in that cluster and 15 people in the second cluster. The first cluster was made up of some folks from Texas, Texas Water Development Board, Texas Parks and Wildlife, Oklahoma In-Stream Flows Advisory Group, people who have consumptive interests, Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation, and then these last 4 down here are all people who manage irrigation districts or conservancy districts in Oklahoma, so water managers. The second cluster, so we have some non-government organizations up here, the University of Oklahoma, Oklahoma Water Survey, the Nature Conservancy, Texas Parks and Wildlife was kind of split between these 2 clusters. Oklahomans for Responsible Water Policy, that's another NGO. So there are some differences between the groups. And some of the questions that we asked, so this first question asked about whether you disagree or agree with the following statements about environmental flows. And so this question was geared towards seeing if people thought environmental flows are important. So we asked about if they can benefit aquatic life, if they can benefit society through recreational opportunities, and benefit society through ecosystem services. And so not a whole lot of difference here between the 2 clusters. This first cluster maybe took a more neutral stance on some of their questions, and one person disagreed that environmental flows are important for recreational opportunities, but overall there's some agreement that environmental flows are important. The second question asked about if in-stream flows or environmental flows, current flow conditions throughout the Red River Basin, so without any environmental flows policies, are they sufficient for fish and freshwater mussels? Are they sufficient to support recreation? And the last question asked about, is implementing environmental flows only feasible in river basins where there's a surplus of water? And I think there were some differences between the 2 groups here. So this second group sort of disagreed with those, kind of saying that no, current flow conditions aren't sufficient. There was a pretty big split here in the first group, so not a lot of people came to any sort of agreement. So yeah. And this next question asked, so it was kind of a paired question. This question came first, and this question followed. And basically, the only difference between these is that the second question asked about climate change. So the question reads, please indicate the extent to which you agree or disagree with the following statements about water availability in the near future in the Red River Basin. And each one of these colors is a factor there. So we asked, do you think there will be decreased water for society, decreased water for in-stream flows, increased extreme flooding, increased droughts, increased water conflicts? And so this first question here that, so we have in the first cluster, some agreement and more so of a neutral stance on each one of these factors. In the second cluster, most folks agree that, yeah, these issues will be a problem in the near future, and to a lesser extent, some neutral responses. But when we ask if climate change will be a driving factor of these issues, some folks shift down to taking a neither agree or disagree stance on that. And I think to a lesser extent in the second cluster, some folks did shift down to taking a neutral stance, but most of them stayed with that yeah, climate change would impact those. And so the next question asked about barriers to implementing environmental flows, policies, and programs. So on the y-axis here, we've listed out a bunch of factors that we think might be a barrier to implementing some sort of policy or program, like lack of funding, lack of water usage data, and then the respondents could indicate whether they thought that was a serious barrier, moderate barrier, somewhat of a barrier, or not at all barrier. I didn't see any huge things that popped out to me between these groups. You know, a lot of people in this second cluster thought a lot of these were serious or moderate barriers, and maybe to a lesser extent here in the first cluster, but nothing really popped out to me that stood out of like a single barrier that was important. And the next question asked is kind of a similar question of what information is most needed for decision makers to incorporate environmental flows in water management decisions. And so they could have ranked these factors over here, so hydrologic data, water demand data, stakeholders' willingness to participate, economic benefits of flows, and so on. And so they could have ranked these 1 most important, 7 least important, and I'm showing an average rank here, so lower is better or more important. So both groups thought that hydrologic data was pretty important along with water demand, although there are some differences between the groups here. So cluster 1 thought stakeholder willingness to participate was pretty important, and cluster 2 not so much. Another important difference here is economic benefits of flows. So this second cluster, as well as ecosystem services, thought that those two might be more important than the first cluster here. Yeah, so the next question asked about what sort of policies or programs might be feasible to implement in terms of environmental flows. So some sort of regulatory method, basically a policy saying like you have to release this amount of water. And so we asked about all of these different types of environmental flows or ways to implement them, and the respondents could have selected if they were feasible, somewhat feasible, unfeasible, not feasible. I didn't see any major differences here between the groups, but yeah. And lastly, we asked about whether a decision support tool would be useful to your agency or help your agency make any decisions. And so we asked about some specific aspects of that decision support tool, like priority areas for environmental flows to be established, projections of water availability under future climate scenarios, and priority areas for aquatic conservation based on, range shifts. I would say here that everyone thought that that would be somewhat useful to an extent. Cluster 2 definitely thought that all of those things would be super useful. So yeah. And lastly, the final part of this survey was looking at frequency of communication, and I did a social network analysis with this question. So I asked folks to indicate their frequency of communication with all of these other agencies. So they could have indicated once a week or more, monthly, once every 3 months, or once a year. And each of those clusters is shown in a different color here. So cluster 1 is shown in blue, cluster 2 is shown in red. And so the way this question was set up, we had a list of agencies and organizations that we sent out the survey to. Some of them declined to participate. So some of these folks up here, the Army Corps of Engineers. So people who responded to the survey could indicate that they communicated with them, but they didn't actually participate in the survey. But a major takeaway from this is that we have some pretty strong communication lines between the Oklahoma Water Resources Board and all of these conservancy districts who manage water throughout Oklahoma. So they communicate once a week or more, and they also communicate with some of these conservancy districts and the Army Corps of Engineers up here. So it's a pretty strong communication network there. Also noteworthy is that the Oklahoma In-Stream Flows Advisory Group is that organization that's thinking about maybe implementing some regulations. They communicate with a lot of the agencies here at least once a year, which is good. I think they actually have an annual meeting, so that would make sense that they communicate with those folks there. In terms of interstate communication, so we have Texas Parks and Wildlife, Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. They have a pretty good communication network in their state, but they also communicate with the Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation at least once a year on some things. And yeah, I think that's all I wanted to highlight there. So yeah, this is the social network analysis that I put together from the survey. And some takeaways from the survey. So there was some general agreement that environmental flows are important and that current flow conditions are insufficient for recreational and environmental needs. There's agreement that there are some looming water crisis problems, but uncertainty about whether climate change is a driving factor of those issues. There was no clear agreement on what the barriers are to implementing environmental flows. It could be a combination of many factors as indicated in that question. There's agreement that more detailed hydrological and biological data is needed, but one group emphasized better understanding the economic benefits of environmental flows, which is important. There was no clear mechanism or method identified for what's the best way to implement environmental flows. It would likely need to vary across the basin given differences in water availability and socio-political issues. And they said that some sort of decision support tool would be useful. And finally, the communication varies, but there's some pretty good interstate communication in Oklahoma and Texas. Maybe improving that communication might facilitate better environmental flows science or policy discussion between the states. And so moving to the second part of the project, some decision support tool. I actually started on this project before doing the survey, but given how people responded to the survey, we sort of changed a few things. And yeah, so the thought for some sort of decision support research project. So we were thinking about where would establishing environmental flows be most feasible and maximize freshwater conservation outcomes throughout the basin. So we came up with a conceptual conservation planning framework to identify some sort of priority conservation projects. And so we also wanted to incorporate climatic uncertainty into this because we're thinking about climate change a lot here. And so what we came up with is allowing some sort of biodiversity value index and conservation feasibility, thinking about water availability in terms of the feasibility of implementing environmental flows to vary independently across future climate scenarios, and use this sort of planning framework to identify those high priority areas. So we can sort of coarsely rank sites in terms of where they fall within this quadrant plot here. So ideally, we would want them to be high biodiversity value, high feasibility, but there's some differences in the quadrants, and I'll get to that in a little bit. So we wanted to apply this to meeting in-stream flow targets in terms of conservation feasibility. So what's the likelihood of success of that conservation action? And so we use some data from a postdoc in our labs project here, looking at the average annual satisfaction of environmental flows at each one of these reservoirs and the average annual satisfaction of water that goes out to society for agricultural and municipal uses. And so we're thinking about what's the feasibility of releasing more water from these reservoirs to prevent something like a fish kill, or just having enough habitat for fishes and aquatic life in the ecosystem there. And the other axis of that prioritization framework was biodiversity value. So thinking about what sort of fish species do we have throughout the basin? So we selected a suite of 31 fish species throughout the basin that represent a range of extinction risk or biodiversity value. So thinking about IUCN Red List categories and state level conservation categories. So have things like the black spot shiner in Oklahoma that's a top priority, but in the IUCN it's least concern. Things like the prairie chub that's IUCN vulnerable, but in Oklahoma it's tier 1 top priority. And we also had some, popular recreational fish, things like spotted bass and the green sunfish. So we had overall 31 fish species that represent a range of those conservation biodiversity values. And we created a biodiversity value index based on those fish species distribution models. So for each species under a range of climate scenarios, we had generated, a graduate student in my lab had generated some species distribution models, and we clipped those down to a 50-kilometer reach below each reservoir, and then developed an index of biodiversity value based on the IUCN Red List categories and some state level rankings. And so that's where we're coming up with the y-axis of this framework. For the x-axis, so thinking about conservation feasibility, we're using those values from the hydrologic planning model. So thinking about at each reservoir, we have some sort of societal satisfaction value. So how much water can we give to society, and how much water can we give to environmental flows. And so at each reservoir, we're looking at what if we fully allocate environmental flows, what's the value going to be for societal satisfaction. So for example, at Lake Texoma, we can fully satisfy both of those water needs. At Atoka Reservoir, if we fully allocate for environmental flows, we can only satisfy about 25% of the societal water needs. And at Kemp Reservoir, if we fully allocate environmental flows, we're going to make a lot of people angry, basically. So so that's where the x-axis of this planning model comes from. And again, so we're looking at each one of these factors and allowing climatic uncertainty to play a role here. So for each y and x-axis in that planning model, we're going to allow those factors to vary under these 9 future climate scenarios. And so we can look at each one of those here. So these two plots, so the biodiversity value index is shown here. Conservation feasibility is shown here. And each one of these points is a general circulation model, and each color is showing a representative concentration pathway. And so biodiversity value has a pretty strong pattern from west to east across the basin. In the central portion of the basin, there's a pretty high biodiversity value hotspot, and at the western and eastern extremes, there's pretty low biodiversity value. And if we look at conservation feasibility across the basin, there's a lot of uncertainty. So in some of the eastern reaches, we can fully satisfy societal water needs across all future climate scenarios. Some not so much. In some of the central and western parts of the basin, there's a lot of uncertainty and maybe not so much feasibility. Another way to look at this, though, is to sort of plot out those individual conservation planning frameworks in terms of each site. So each one of these columns here is a climate model and representative concentration pathway, and each one of the points is a site, and we have colored those from east to west in terms of longitude in the basin. And so I can go through each one of these sort of climate models to see where those sites shift under future scenarios. So under the CCSM4 scenario, we can see some of these more drier sites in the western portion of the basin continually shift towards lower conservation feasibility. and some of those more eastern sites kind of stay wet, I guess, stuck over here. In the MIROC 5 model, there was not too much shifting around and increasing emission scenarios, but some of these sites that were over here definitely shifted to more drier sites. A few of these dry sites shifted to more conservation feasibility. And in the MPI ESM LR model, there wasn't a whole lot of variation. Some of these sites shifted around in this space, but there wasn't a whole lot of variation. A different way of looking at that, though, is to sort of apply this conservation planning framework and look at what's the proportion of times that a site fell within each one of these quadrants, right? And so, so each one of these pie charts is showing out of those 9 future climate scenarios, how many times did it fall within each one of those quadrants. And so we can look at where are the outcomes consistent across future climate scenarios. So there's a subset of sites here in the central, east central portion of the basin that are consistently high biodiversity value, high conservation feasibility. So those are kind of like a low risk conservation investment. You would want to put some money in there because you can get some consistent maximized outcomes across all of those future climate scenarios. In the western reaches, there's pretty high uncertainty because each one of these sites fall within at least one of these quadrants once, or just remain consistently low biodiversity value, low conservation feasibility. There's some mixed outcomes in terms of the central reaches. So sometimes they can remain high biodiversity value, high conservation feasibility, but sometimes shift to low conservation feasibility. So you might make some people mad if you take away water from the societal uses and allocate them to environmental flows. And in the eastern reaches, there's pretty consistently low biodiversity value, but high conservation feasibility, except for one of these sites over here. So these are kind of like a why not site. I mean, if you have the water available, why not allocate it to environmental flows as well? So the implications of this sort of coarse scale tool is to maybe identify some priority sites for improving in-stream flows and biodiversity outcomes. So ideally, we want to, maintain some sort of natural flow regime below these reservoirs to help out species like this, the plains minnow and prairie chub that are some declining species throughout the region. And another implication of this is, incorporating climatic uncertainty into conservation planning frameworks could maybe help us identify some sites that have consistent outcomes and reduce the risk of conservation investments. And maybe bridge the gap between the research and implementation phase in conservation projects that a lot of projects end up getting hold up between research and implementation. And so to finish up here, I'd like to acknowledge some folks that helped me out a lot with this project. My advisor, Dr. Tom Neeson at OU, postdoc on our lab, Rachel Hovarg, Abigail Lynch, Craig Falkert, and Sean Carter at the USGS for helping me out with the Science to Action Fellowship project, and Dan Allen and Karen Vaughn at OU for providing some input on the project as well. And especially the Science to Action Fellowship through the National Climate Center, USGS, and the folks here at the South Central Climate Center as well.